What occurs when justice and privilege intersect? A no-nonsense judge confronts an arrogant socialite, and she learns a life lesson that she will never forget. Witness the event. The courtroom was crowded that morning, with a subdued hum of conversation as individuals shuffled into their seats. The Los Angeles County Courthouse was experiencing an ordinary day, with the exception of one minor detail. It was anticipated that this hearing would generate interest. Tiffany Halstead, a socialite with a reputation for reckless behavior and an inflated sense of self, was scheduled to appear before Judge William Grant, who was renowned for his keen intellect and unshakable demeanor. Judge Grant was esteemed in the legal community for his impartiality and uncompromising approach to justice. Tiffany arrived in her customary manner, late and without apology. She entered the room with the grace of a red carpet event, donning oversized spectacles and designer labels. The scene was attempted to be minimized by her lawyer, who was visibly uncomfortable and walked swiftly behind her. The courtroom, which was accustomed to maintaining a certain level of decorum, fell silent as the attention of the audience transferred to her. She halted in the center of the aisle, appearing to be unaware of the individuals who were awaiting her to take a seat. She gestured for her lawyer to step aside with a dismissive wave in order to place her luggage on the bench. She removed her spectacles with exaggerated flair, radiating a sense of entitlement as she surveyed the scene as if it were beneath her. The air in the room changed instantaneously as Judge Grant entered moments later. The murmurs diminished, and a respectful silence replaced them. The tall frame and placid authority of Grant, who was in his mid-50s, rendered him an imposing figure. Before he could settle into his chair, his acute eyes momentarily surveyed the room. "All rise," the bailiff declared. Tiffany hesitated, evidently irritated, before rising with a heaving exhale. Her demeanor begged the question, "What am I doing here?" Judge Grant did not respond. He adjusted his spectacles, opened the file in front of him, and commenced the proceedings. Tiffany's case was relatively straightforward. A pedestrian was imperiled as a result of a series of parking violations that were further exacerbated by an incident of reckless driving. However, Tiffany's presumption was about to cause a dramatic turn in what could have been a routine hearing. Tiffany's demeanor changed as Judge Grant began to specify the allegations. She reclined in her chair, crossed her arms, and rolled her eyes, a clear indication of disdain that was not overlooked. However, Judge Grant maintained a composed demeanor rather than confronting her conduct. His words were deliberate, and his tone was measured. It appeared as though he was encouraging her to persist in her behavior. Even the most seasoned court regulars sat up a little straighter, detecting something brewing, as the tension in the room began to build. However, Tiffany was unaware of the tempest she was igniting and had no intention of retreating. Tiffany's irritation intensified with each word Judge Grant spoke, as she adjusted in her seat. She began striking her manicured nails against the wooden table, which was audible to those in the vicinity. Tiffany dismissed him with a dismissive flick of her hand, despite her lawyer's urgent murmur. The chamber, which was already tense, appeared to maintain its breath. She scarcely glanced up when Judge Grant requested that she verify her identity. "Yes, that is me," she replied, her demeanor betraying a lack of interest. The room reverberated with a collective murmur. Despite the fact that his eyes dwelt on Tiffany for a moment longer than usual, Judge Grant maintained a composed expression. "Miss Halstead," he began, his voice steady, "in this courtroom, we maintain a certain level of decorum. I recommend that you adjust your tone accordingly." Tiffany smirked, as if the judge's remarks were a jest. She reclined in her chair and twirled a strand of her blonde hair between her fingertips. She replied, "Certainly, Your Honor," her tone tinged with disdain. The room was filled with the gentle echoes of gasps. The court reporter momentarily paused before proceeding with her transcription. Even Tiffany's attorney, who was visibly mortified, concealed his face in his hands. Nevertheless, Judge Grant maintained his composure. "Miss Halstead," he repeated, his voice firm yet composed, "do you comprehend the allegations that have been leveled against you today?" Tiffany once more rolled her eyes, this time emitting an audible murmur. "To be frank, I am not interested. These are merely trivial parking tickets, and what is the point of causing someone to be frightened because I applied the gas too quickly? This is a complete waste of time." At that moment, the courtroom was silenced. All eyes were now on Judge Grant, who meticulously closed the folder in front of him. He deliberately placed his spectacles on the bench after removing them. It appeared as though time had been suspended for a brief period. He said slowly, "Miss Halstead," his voice calm but bearing an unmistakable weight. "I would suggest that you exercise caution in your word choice from this point forward." Even the most disinterested court spectators were compelled to sit up due to the gravity of his tone. However, Tiffany, who was still unaware of the gravity of the situation, merely shrugged. "What? "It is accurate," she stated, this time leaning forward. "I have not caused any harm to anyone. This entire situation is absurd." However, Tiffany neglected to acknowledge that her words were no longer being ignored. The courtroom was about to witness a response that they would never forget, and Judge Grant's silence spoke volumes. His piercing gaze was fixed on Tiffany as Judge Grant reclined back in his chair. The room remained silent, as the weight of the moment pressed down on all those in attendance. Even Tiffany's attorney, who had been nervously shuffling documents, paused to observe the judge. Judge Grant's tone was almost conversational as he inquired, "Do you believe this is ridiculous, Miss Halstead?" The authority in his voice was unmistakable, despite the fact that he did not elevate it. Tiffany snorted. "Yes, I do. I mean, it's not like I robbed a bank or anything. This is just overkill." She waved her hand dismissively, as if she were sweeping away an illusory annoyance. Judge Grant nodded slowly. He stated, "I understand," as he folded his hands on the bench. The suspense was only exacerbated by his composed demeanor, which caused the spectators to inch closer to the edge of their seats. He continued, "Miss Halstead, allow me to clarify a point. The charges against you encompass not only reckless driving but also endangering the life of a pedestrian. The law does not assess accountability based on the size of the crime, but rather on its impact. Do you comprehend this?" Tiffany once more rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath, "Sure, sure. Whatever you say." The murmur was gentle, yet it resonated in the courtroom silence. Despite the judge's composure, there was a subtle narrowing of his eyes and a pause that indicated that something was about to change. Judge Grant began, "Miss Halstead, do you remember the incident that occurred 2 weeks ago? The one that brought you here today?" Tiffany appeared to be disinterested as she shrugged. "A man stepped off the curb. I honked, and he retreated." The incident concluded. The judge's eyebrows were elevated. "Is that the conclusion of the narrative, sir?" She crossed her arms and replied, "Yes. No harm, no foul." However, Judge Grant was not yet completed. He retrieved a document from the bench and flipped through it with measured precision. Then, he addressed the courtroom. He stated with authority, "Let the record show that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Edward Lopez, was a 67-year-old retired teacher. He was crossing the street legally when Miss Halstead accelerated toward him, causing him to stumble and injure his wrist. He has since required medical attention and continues to experience pain." Tiffany's grin wavered for the first time. She gazed at her lawyer, who whispered something to her, but she again dismissed him. She murmured, "I did not strike him. He was unharmed." "Miss Halstead," Judge Grant continued, now redirected his entire attention to her, "does this sound like no harm, no foul to you?" However, Judge Grant's subsequent actions would render it abundantly apparent that Tiffany's actions had far-reaching consequences she could no longer disregard, before she could open her mouth to respond. Tiffany was the focus of Judge Grant's unwavering gaze, and his voice was measured as he continued. "Miss Halstead, your refusal to recognize the gravity of your actions is more concerning than the charges themselves." Tiffany maintained an air of complacency as she reclined in her chair, despite the fact that the tension in the room was becoming increasingly apparent. "Look, I assured you that I did not strike him. Individuals are becoming increasingly dramatic in recent years." The courtroom gallery let out a few murmurs in response to that statement. Judge Grant briefly paused before continuing to speak, tapping his pen gently against the desk. "Dramatic," he reiterated, his tone remaining consistent. "Miss Halstead, would you like to hear directly from Mr. Lopez? He is present in this courtroom today." Anticipation permeated the atmosphere. Tiffany's eyes briefly darted toward the hall, and her confident facade trembled. Mr. Lopez, a man in the second row, sat peacefully with his arm in a sling. His weathered visage conveyed no wrath, rather, it conveyed a subtle disappointment that seemed to penetrate more deeply than any harsh words could. Tiffany moved uncomfortably in her seat, but her defiance was not entirely absent. "I am confident that he is well," she murmured, although her voice was devoid of its previous confidence. The room was commanded by Judge Grant's presence, as he leaned forward slightly. "Miss Halstead, your disregard for the suffering of this man is a testament to your character. However, this is not solely about him, it is also about the precedent we establish when individuals of privilege believe they are immune to accountability." The courtroom was so silent that the faint scraping of the court reporter's pen could be heard. Judge Grant was the sole focus of attention at this time. He then spoke with a calm that belied the weight of his words, "Since you appear to be unconcerned about the consequences of your actions, perhaps it is time you experience them firsthand." He waited to see what he would do next. Tiffany's prior confidence was crumbling as she blinked. Her voice was suffused with genuine concern for the first time as she inquired, "What is that supposed to mean?" Judge Grant did not respond immediately. Rather, he extended his hand to the bailiff, who presented him with a compact stack of documents. The judge commenced reading aloud the penalties, mandatory community service, and court-ordered sensitivity training that Tiffany would be required to complete. However, it was not the penalties themselves that had the most significant impact, rather, it was the manner in which he conveyed them, which included a powerful message about the responsibility that comes with living in a shared society, empathy, and privilege. However, the unexpected ultimate decision announced by Judge Grant was what truly shook Tiffany, and the entire courtroom, and would force her to confront reality. The documents were placed on the table by Judge Grant, who maintained a steady and unwavering gaze. Before they were even spoken, the room seemed to be filled with the weight of his next words. "Miss Halstead," he began, "I have thoroughly examined the specifics of this case. In light of the gravity of your actions and your flagrant disregard for accountability, I am imposing a sentence that I am confident will not only rectify the legal violations but also offer you the much-needed perspective." Tiffany's earlier flippancy was displaced by a flicker of unease, and she sat up straighter. She repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief, "Perspective?" "Yes," Judge Grant replied with conviction. "In addition to the fines and 200 hours of community service, you will volunteer at the downtown women's shelter for the next 30 days. You will have the opportunity to work directly with individuals who have experienced hardship, often without their own fault. Perhaps this will help you comprehend the consequences of entitlement and carelessness." The room was filled with a collective murmur. The crowd's varied reactions were palpable, as this was not the typical sentence one would expect in a case of this nature. A few individuals nodded in agreement. Other individuals exchanged incredulous glances. However, Tiffany's response was the most revealing. "You must be joking," she exclaimed, her voice erupting. "What do you want me to do? Socialize with homeless individuals? That is not my concern." The expression on Judge Grant's face remained unchanged, however, his tone became increasingly icy. "Miss Halstead, it is precisely that mentality that has brought you to this courtroom today. Your actions are indicative of a lack of comprehension, a refusal to recognize the impact of your decisions on those in your vicinity. This is not a penalty, it is an opportunity for personal development. And let me be clear, a sentence that is significantly more severe will be imposed if you fail to comply." Tiffany's lawyer pulled at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but she yanked her arm away. "This is absurd. You are unable to compel me to do this." Her outburst was silenced by Judge Grant's uplifted hand. "Miss Halstead, this court has the power to impose community service as a component of your sentence. You are required to report to the shelter by 8 a.m. each morning, and your supervisor will provide weekly progress updates. If you fail to comply, I will see you back in this courtroom under significantly less favorable circumstances." The room was once again silent, and the weight of Judge Grant's words hung heavily in the air. Tiffany's face was red with fury, however, she refrained from uttering a word. Stunned and mute, she remained seated. However, the moment was not yet completely over. Judge Grant's concluding remarks would have an indelible impact on all attendees, not just Tiffany. Despite Tiffany's apparent defiance, Judge Grant maintained his composed demeanor as he adjusted his spectacles. He allowed the silence to persist for a brief period to guarantee that his subsequent statements would be delivered with the utmost impact. "Miss Halstead," he began, "this courtroom is not intended to humiliate or belittle you. It is intended to uphold justice and, when feasible, to educate. Your privilege has protected you from consequences for an excessive amount of time, and it has resulted in the loss of your capacity to empathize. This is not about punishment, it is about assisting you in reclaiming your humanity." The courtroom maintained its collective breath. Tiffany, evidently uneasy, cast an inquisitive look at the gallery, her confidence diminishing. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but she appeared to reconsider her decision. Judge Grant inquired, his tone becoming almost conversational, "Are you aware of the response Mr. Lopez provided when questioned about his feelings toward you?" Tiffany's gaze shifted to Mr. Lopez, who remained seated in the gallery, as she shook her head. His demeanor continued to be one of subdued disappointment. The judge continued, he said, "I don't want her to suffer. I just want her to understand. Because if she doesn't, she'll keep hurting people, and one day, it might be something she can't undo." The words struck like a weapon. Tiffany's customary composure unraveled as her face turned pale. For the first time, her defiance was replaced by discomfort, and possibly even remorse. Judge Grant refused to relent. "Mr. Lopez, a man whom you nearly injured, has opted for grace over anger. He could have requested more severe penalties, but he requested an alternative, an opportunity for you to learn. This sentence embodies that. Tiffany's confidence was eroded as she shifted uneasily in her chair. The room was so silent that even the slightest sound, such as the creak of a bench or the movement of papers, appeared to be amplified. "You'll be required to report to the downtown women's shelter on Monday morning," Judge Grant continued. "There, you will encounter women who have encountered obstacles that are beyond comprehension. Some have lost everything, while others are in the process of rebuilding their lives from the ground up. You will listen to their narratives, and I trust that this will help you comprehend the importance of accountability and humility." Tiffany appeared to be considering protesting, however, the gravity of the situation prevented her from speaking. Her attorney placed a hand on her arm, instructing her to remain silent. However, Tiffany's genuine transformation would not commence until she confronted the harsh realities that awaited her beyond the protective cocoon of her privilege, even as the judge's words began to penetrate her consciousness. The conclusion of the hearing was announced by the sharp clang of the gavel. Judge Grant announced, "This court is adjourned," as he rose from his seat and exited the courtroom. His voice was firm. The tension in the room appeared to persist, reminiscent of a tempest that had recently passed but left an indelible impression. Tiffany's expression was a blend of indignation and disbelief, as she remained seated. Her attorney leaned in, whispering hastily, but she scarcely acknowledged him. The gallery began to empty, and the murmurs of the observers intensified as they engaged in discussions regarding the events they had just witnessed. Mr. Lopez stood slowly, his slung arm serving as a conspicuous reminder of the incident that had brought them all to this location. He glanced at Tiffany as he passed, his expression remaining resolute yet kind. She refrained from gazing at him, instead focusing on the table that was directly in front of her. Reporters had already assembled outside the courthouse, anxious to document the aftermath of the eventful hearing. Tiffany's name, which was already a headline due to her socialite antics, was now associated with a moment of courtroom drama that had captivated all in attendance. As she emerged, she was accompanied by her attorney, who protected her from the deluge of inquiries. Cameras flashed. One reporter inquired, "Miss Halstead, do you have any commentary on the sentencing that took place today? Do you believe the sentence was justifiable? What are your thoughts on Judge Grant's decision?" Tiffany's customary arrogance briefly reappeared. "No comment," she abruptly stated, advancing through the crowd and into the waiting vehicle. However, the exterior of the building began to deteriorate. Her shoulders slumped as the doors closed and the reporter's commotion diminished. It appeared as though reality was beginning to be accepted for the first time. The story was the most popular headline on all news outlets that evening. The video clips from the courtroom, which included Judge Grant's powerful remarks, went viral, igniting a widespread conversation. Social media was ablaze with opinions, with some individuals commending the judge's decision and others denouncing Tiffany's conduct. However, Mr. Lopez's brief statement outside the courthouse was the most profound commentary. "I am concerned about her failure," he stated. "I sincerely hope that she learns, as the moment we cease to learn, we cease to develop, and that is when we are truly defeated." His words resonated beyond the confines of the courtroom due to their simplicity. For Tiffany, however, the lesson was only the beginning. A world that was far removed from her privileged lifestyle and designer handbags loomed ahead as Monday approached. Tiffany would soon learn that genuine change does not occur through verbal communication, rather, it is achieved through observation, action, and the sensation of the weight of another's reality. Tiffany was greeted by an unfamiliar chill on Monday, which was felt in both her bosom and the air. The hesitation in her irises was concealed by her oversized sunglasses as she stood outside the downtown women's shelter. The building, which was modest in size, was a hive of activity as volunteers and personnel rushed about. Tiffany experienced a sense of alienation for the first time in an extended period. The warm murmur of voices and the clatter of kitchen utensils welcomed her as she entered. A staff member, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached her. "You must be Tiffany," she said, her tone being both cordial and firm. "Welcome. Let us commence." At first, the hours went at a leisurely pace. Tiffany was tasked with the responsibility of assisting in the preparation, serving, and cleanup of meals. She maintained a low profile, refraining from speaking and eschewing her customary bravado. However, as the day progressed, she began to observe details that she had not previously observed, such as the resilience in the stories she overheard, the camaraderie among the staff, and the gratitude in the expressions of the shelter's guests. Tiffany was informed of the challenges faced by a single mother of 3 during brunch. Her words were burdened by the weight of years of adversity, despite the fact that her voice was unwavering. "You believe that you have everything figured out," she said, her gaze catching Tiffany's. However, Life has a way of guiding you toward the things that truly matter. Tiffany's thoughts were unusually tranquil as she drove home that evening. The words of Judge Grant and the images of the individuals she had encountered remained in her mind. She began to question whether there was more to life than the world she had constructed for herself, a world of privilege, isolation, and superficiality, for the first time. Tiffany's mandatory service persisted in the subsequent weeks. With each passing day, the barriers she had constructed to protect herself began to crumble. She began to alter gradually, almost imperceptibly, by listening more and speaking less. Tiffany appeared before Judge Grant once more after her sentence had been completed, this time in a more contemplative and subdued manner. "I am grateful for your unwavering support," she expressed with a composed tone. Judge Grant's expression exhibited a minor softening as he nodded. "The genuine gratitude will be expressed when you apply the knowledge you have acquired to effect change." Tiffany left the courthouse with a small but potent hope, the opportunity to rebuild not only her life but also her perspective, as the sun shone brightly overhead. Therefore, Tiffany's journey served as a reminder to all that change is feasible. However, it necessitates humility, fortitude, and the willingness to confront one's shortcomings. What actions will you take today to allow your heart and intellect to be open to the lessons that life has to offer? If this narrative resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments section and subscribe to receive additional narratives that encourage introspection and personal development.